There is a lie that the world has never stopped repeating about the people who suffer the most. The lie says they suffer because they are weak, that they carry too much pain because they do not have enough strength to hold on, that they stumble repeatedly because they lack something: discipline, faith, structure, control. And for years, perhaps decades, you believe this about yourself. But what if this entire narrative were inverted? What if the people who suffer the most in this world were not the most fragile, but the ones carrying the greatest amount of light within a framework that was specifically built to extinguish that light? Today, you will understand something that the oldest Gnostic texts in the world tried to preserve for 2,000 years before orthodoxy buried them in the desert. Something that the Apocryphon of John describes with a precision that makes the spine chill. That the Pistis Sophia encoded in symbolic language, that the Gospel of Philip whispered on the margins of scrolls that barely survived. There is a category of human being that the Gnostics called pneumatic, and these beings do not struggle because they are weak. They struggle because they carry a frequency that the material world was not built to support. This video is for you to understand what you truly are. Let us start from the beginning, not from your birth. From the beginning of everything, the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Hermetic texts written between the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, attributed to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus, describes creation with an image that will stay in your mind for weeks. It speaks of a primordial nous, a divine mind, perfect, motionless, silent. This mind looked down, and the reflection it saw in the mirror of matter was so beautiful that it descended. It fell in love with its own image reflected in the material world, and in that descent, it became imprisoned. This is the myth of the fall of consciousness into the world of matter. It is not a myth about weakness. It is a myth about excessive love for the experience, about the consciousness that desired to feel so much that it forgot where it came from. Now, thousands of years after that fall, there are human beings who carry within themselves a spark of that original nous. The Gnostics called this the pneuma, the divine breath. And these beings, according to the Nag Hammadi texts, are not exclusive products of this world. They are foreigners here. I want you to think about this for a moment. Foreigner, not someone who was rejected, not someone who failed. Foreigner as someone who came from somewhere else. The Gospel of Philip, found among the Nag Hammadi codices in Egypt in 1945, says something that few translations preserve with the proper brutality. It says that light and darkness, life and death, left and right are brothers, inseparable. But the pneumatics do not belong to any of these pairs. They are above the dichotomy, and precisely because of this, the world expels them like a body expels an incompatible transplant. Incompatibility, this is the central mechanism. It is not a moral judgment. It is not a spiritual punishment. It is physics. It is biology. It is what happens when you try to vibrate a string at the wrong frequency inside an instrument that was not tuned for that note. The material world, according to Gnostic cosmology, was not created by the highest God. It was created by the Archons, inferior, partially blind entities who modeled the visible world from an imperfect copy of an original blueprint that they could barely see. The Apocryphon of John, perhaps the most elaborate Gnostic text found in Nag Hammadi, describes this process with a disconcerting wealth of detail. The leader of the Archons is called Yaldabaoth. He created the material world believing himself to be the only God. He said, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God besides me." And this phrase, this specific phrase, the Gnostics recognized as the definitive sign of his blindness, because a being who truly was the supreme God would never need to claim exclusivity. Insecurity is the trait of the small. Yaldabaoth and his Archons built a system, a world, a reality, and this world was structured around one thing: keeping consciousness in a downward motion, keeping the focus on matter, on survival, on identification with the body and with reactive emotions. Because as long as the human being is totally identified with these layers, the divine spark within him remains asleep. Now think about the world you live in. Think about how much of this world is designed to keep your attention trapped at the lowest level of experience. Fear of not having enough, constant competition, reward cycles that never fully satisfy, collective narratives that define your value by what you produce, by what you possess, by what others think of you. The Gnostics, 2,000 years ago, did not have social media algorithms to analyze, but they described the mechanism with a precision that makes the line between myth and diagnosis disappear. And here is where the narrative about the chosen ones begins to make sense in a way that will change how you read your own story. When a pneumatic person, someone with an active spark, comes into contact with the material world, something inevitable happens. The system tries to calibrate them. It tries to level them, not out of conscious malice, but out of homeostasis. The system needs balance, and a being vibrating at a frequency different from the dominant frequency represents an anomaly that the system automatically tries to correct. This correction has many faces. Sometimes it comes as social isolation. You cannot fit in. No matter how hard you try, there is always something slightly uncomfortable about everyday interactions, as if you were watching a play in which everyone knows the lines except you. Sometimes it comes as extreme sensitivity. Sounds, emotions, environments, everything penetrates deeper than it should. You feel what people around you do not feel. You pick up on tensions before they manifest. You carry the emotional weight of the spaces you inhabit. Sometimes it comes as an inexplicable dissatisfaction. Everything is technically fine, the job, the relationships, the structure of life, but there is an emptiness at the center that no material achievement can fill, as if you were hungry for something that no food from this world produces. And sometimes it comes as a direct collapse. The life you built, which everyone said should be enough, falls. The relationship ends. The career implodes, health fails, and in the middle of the rubble, instead of total destruction, you find something unexpected, a clarity that never existed before. This pattern, this specific pattern of construction and collapse, of fitting in and expulsion, of extreme effort without the return that effort should guarantee, this pattern is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of frequency. The Pistis Sophia, one of the longest and most complex Gnostic texts, dating from the 3rd century AD, describes the journey of Sophia, the divine wisdom, through the realms of the Archons. Sophia is a spark of the divine that descended into the material world out of an impulse of curiosity, of love, of a desire to create. And throughout the text, she is captured, imprisoned, robbed of her light by each archontic layer she crosses. But what happens at the end of Sophia's story is not extinction. It is recovery. Layer by layer, what was lost is restored. Not because Sophia became stronger in the raw sense, but because she learned to recognize each archon for what it was, a limited copy trying to pass itself off as absolute. And by naming each one, by seeing each illusion clearly, she ceases to be imprisoned by them. The text uses the word gnosis, knowledge, not as intellectual information, but as recognition, to recognize, to see something for what it is. And here is the heart of everything this video wants to say. The struggle you have been living is not against external enemies. It is not against circumstances that need to be corrected. It is a struggle of recognition. The work of the pneumatics is not to defeat the material world on the material world's own terms. It is to learn to see the layers of the system for what they are, and to keep the frequency active despite the constant pressure to lower it. But before continuing, I need you to understand what the pressure to lower the frequency actually looks like in everyday life. Because it rarely comes with a sign saying what it is. It comes as the voice that says, "Be realistic." It comes as the family that says, "You are exaggerating." It comes as the belief system that says, "Your sensitivity is a flaw, not a gift." It comes as the accumulated fatigue of decades trying to compress yourself into sizes that are not yours. The Gospel of Philip makes an observation that seems simple but has depths that take years to fully absorb completely. It says that light came into the world, and the world did not know it. And then it says something that few readers stop to unpack, that the light did not come to conquer the world. It came because it could not stay where it was without moving. Light moves. That is the only pattern. You are not struggling because you failed to find the right place. You are struggling because the nature of light is to break through barriers. And every barrier you cross, every collapse, every reinvention, every time you reached the limit and did not break completely, is evidence that the light within you cannot be contained the way the system wants. This is not a motivational metaphor. It is cosmology. It is the model of the universe that the Gnostics developed as an orientation map for people exactly like you. Let me show you how this appears in the Apocryphon of John with a specificity that will make you stop breathing for a few seconds. In the Apocryphon of John, there is a scene where Yaldabaoth creates the material human being, Adam. And the moment the body is ready, the Archons realize that the creature they made is inert, without real life, without authentic movement. They built a perfect body that could not stand up. Then Yaldabaoth is induced by a voice from above, by a plan that comes from outside the system he controls, to breathe into the human being, and in that breath he inadvertently transfers into Adam the spark of light he carried within himself, the spark he had stolen from the higher realm before building the material world. Think about that. The creator of the material system, in his attempt to create a servant, accidentally placed inside the human being the very thing that would make this being greater than any system trying to contain him. The Archons realize what happened, and their response is immediate. They deepen the forgetfulness. They increase the weight of matter. They multiply the layers of identification with the body, with the ego, with collective narratives, all to make the human being forget what he carries. Forgetfulness is the strategy, not destruction. Destruction would be useless because you cannot destroy a spark that comes from before the system. You can only try to make it forget itself. And now look at what this means in the life of a pneumatic in 2024. You forgot yourself countless times. Every time you accepted that what you feel is not real. Every time you agreed that your vision is distorted simply because nobody around you can see what you see. Every time you convinced yourself that dissatisfaction is a character flaw and not a sign of guidance. Each of these moments is the system of forgetfulness working, not because you are weak, but because the system is very old and very sophisticated in the art of making the light doubt itself. But here is what the system cannot control. There is a moment, and every pneumatic has lived at least one version of it, in which doubt reaches its limit, in which the weight of forgetfulness becomes so heavy that the weight itself breaks the layer, and beneath the ruins the spark appears, not as a grandiose revelation, as a silent recognition, as that instant when you stop in the middle of a crisis and, without being able to explain why, feel that there is something in you that is completely intact, that nothing that happened out there touched this center, that all the external collapse happened around something that simply did not participate in it. The Gnostics called this the unshakable spark, the pneuma that cannot be destroyed because it does not belong to this system. And do you know what is most fascinating? They said that the very fact that you recognize this, the very moment of recognition, is itself gnosis happening. It is not a prerequisite for liberation. It is liberation. It is what liberation means. You do not need to get somewhere to activate the spark. You need to recognize that it was never deactivated. Now, I want to talk about something that Gnostic texts rarely describe directly, but which is present in every line of the Corpus Hermeticum when you learn to read the right language: the issue of relationships between pneumatics. Because one of the most painful things in the experience of the chosen ones is not isolation itself. It is the specific kind of loneliness that happens when you are surrounded by people but remain fundamentally alone. When you try to share something you saw, some layer of reality that seems obvious to you, and the eyes around you go blank, not hostile necessarily, just absent, as if the frequency of your observation were not receivable on the receiver they have available. The Corpus Hermeticum, in Treatise 7, describes something that goes straight to the heart of this. Hermes speaks with his son Tat about the nous, the divine mind, and Tat asks if all human beings have the nous, and Hermes says no. He says that the nous came to dwell in the beings who are capable of receiving it. The others are governed by other principles, not out of malice, but by constitution. This distinction is not a moral hierarchy. It is a description of configuration. Think of it this way: not every antenna picks up every frequency, not because some antennas are superior to others in intrinsic value, but because they were built for different purposes. An AM antenna is not inferior to an FM antenna. They simply operate in different spectrums. Pneumatics operate in a spectrum that most human configurations were not tuned to pick up, and this creates a functional loneliness that has no solution at the level where you usually try to solve it, the level of relationships, of communication, of searching for the right place with the right people. The solution, according to Gnostic tradition, is not horizontal. It is not finding more people like you, although that helps and is real and is a grace when it happens. The solution is vertical. It is the deepening of the relationship with the internal spark, the pneuma, which makes horizontal loneliness become bearable, not because it disappears, but because it loses the power to define your experience. When you no longer need the external world to validate what you know internally, archontic pressure loses one of its main footholds. This leads me to something I need to say carefully because it is easy to misunderstand. Gnostic cosmology is not a call to disengagement from the world. It is not a philosophy of withdrawal. It is not a justification for isolation or for indifference toward collective human suffering. The Pistis Sophia is explicit on this point. Sophia does not free herself by abandoning the archontic realms. She crosses them, one by one, with recognition, not with escape. And every time she recognizes an archon for what it is, a distortion of something real, a second-generation copy of a light it only saw from afar, she recovers the fraction of her luminosity that had been imprisoned at that level. To cross, not to flee. To recognize, not to ignore. For pneumatics living in this century, this has concrete and sometimes counterintuitive implications. That relationship that ended devastatingly and that you spent years trying to understand, that is an archon you were being called to cross, not to defeat. That job that consumed 6 years of your life and in the end revealed that what you thought you were building was an elaborate illusion? Also, that version of yourself that you killed so carefully, the version that believed certain things about the world and about yourself that time proved false? This collapse of identity that felt like destruction was actually an archon being named, seen, and released from the capacity to control your trajectory. And there are physical signs of this that the Hermetic texts describe with a specificity that will surprise you. The Corpus Hermeticum speaks of a quality of attention that pneumatics possess, an ability to be present in multiple layers of reality simultaneously. While most people experience the world on a single plane, the plane of visible causes and effects, the pneumatic is constantly aware of undercurrents, of patterns that cut across the surface of events, of connections that have not been declared but are perceived with the certainty of something seen, not deduced. This is not confusion. It is expanded perception operating in a world that was not calibrated for it. Another sign is what could be called memory without origin. A sense of longing for something you never lived in this life. A familiarity with ideas, places, or ways of seeing the world that your biographical history does not explain. Gnostic cosmology calls this anamnesis, the process of remembering what the soul knew before descending into the material world. I am not asking you to accept this as doctrine. I am showing you that the Gnostic map accurately describes something that countless pneumatics report without knowing the name. The pattern of pneumatic life is not a linear ascent. It is a spiral. You pass through the same type of lesson multiple times in increasing layers of depth until the recognition is complete. And every time the system tries to make you believe that being back in a similar theme means you failed, that is the voice of forgetfulness trying one last maneuver. But there is one thing the system has never been able to fake. And that is what distinguishes a pneumatic from someone who has simply gone through hard things. It is the internal guidance. Every pneumatic has a compass that does not come from the outside, a way of knowing that does not operate by the rules of conventional reasoning, an ability to distinguish truth from illusion that sometimes precedes any logical evidence. The Corpus Hermeticum calls this the active nous. The mind that knows because it is made of the same substance as what it knows, not because it received information from the outside. In modern language, we call this intuition. But intuition is a word that has been completely domesticated and emptied by casual use. The intuition that the Hermetic texts describe is not a vague sixth sense. It is the operation of the deepest aspect of consciousness, the aspect that learned nothing because it never needed to learn. It simply recognizes. And for pneumatics, this faculty is not a spiritual curiosity. It is a survival system. Every time you went against this inner voice to please the external system, to satisfy family, to fulfill social expectation, to fit into the definition the world had of success, you contracted, you compressed, you became smaller than you are. And every time you followed it, even without proof, even without support, even without any rational guarantee that you were doing the right thing, something opened, not necessarily easy, not necessarily without pain, but with the unmistakable quality of being in the right direction. This is the frequency working. This is the pneuma pointing the way back to itself. Now we need to talk about what happens when a pneumatic wakes up completely to what he is. Because this is the part that most narratives about the chosen ones omit, or describe in such a romanticized way that it loses touch with what actually happens. Waking up does not make life easier. Initially, it often makes it harder. When the spark begins to move with more power, the archontic pressure increases proportionally. The relationships that were built upon the compressed version of you enter a crisis. The identity systems that functioned as stabilizers lose their function. The comfort of forgetfulness, and there was a real comfort in that, there is no use denying it, ceases to be available. You see more clearly, and seeing clearly in the middle of a world built upon illusion is not an immediately peaceful experience. It is disorienting before it is liberating. The Pistis Sophia describes exactly this phase when Sophia crosses the densest realms of the Archons. She cries out, she laments, she describes the weight of imprisonment with an emotional intensity that would be disturbing if you did not know what was happening. She is not falling apart, she is crossing through. The difference between falling apart and crossing through does not lie in the level of pain. It lies in the presence of the spark during the pain, in the thread of recognition that remains active even while everything around is collapsing, in the capacity to feel the full weight of the material world upon you and, at the same time, know that you are not that weight. This is the marker, not the absence of suffering, the simultaneous presence of suffering and the consciousness that observes the suffering without being destroyed by it. If you have ever lived this, and I suspect that if you have made it this far, you have, then you know exactly what I am talking about. You know that strange and sometimes disconcerting space where you are crying, and at the same time there is something in you that is completely calm, completely present, completely intact. This is not dissociation. It is the spark functioning exactly as it was described 2,000 years ago. Now I will show you the pattern of the chosen ones throughout history, not as hagiography, not as sainthood, but as a map of recognition, so that you can see that what you are living is no accident, is no anomaly, and did not begin with you. Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of Mary, another Gnostic text, found at the end of the 19th century in an antiquities market in Egypt and dated to the 2nd century AD, is presented as the one whom Jesus loved more than the other disciples. Not because she was special in the sense of privilege, but because she saw what the others could not see. She understood the visions. She retained the inner teaching while Peter and Andrew argued about what the external words meant. And when she shares with the disciples what Jesus taught her in a vision, Peter's response is revealing. He says, "Would it be possible that the Master spoke with a woman without our knowledge? Should we change and listen to her?" It is not simply misogyny, although it is that too. It is the archontic pattern of rejection of the pneumatic who sees more than the system considers acceptable. It is the system trying to invalidate the recognition by attacking the identity of the bearer. And Mary does not back down completely. She weeps, and this is important. She feels the weight of it, but she says what she saw. The spark does not yield to the pressure of invalidation. John, the disciple to whom the Gospel of John attributes a relationship of special closeness to Jesus, wrote texts in the book of Revelation that generations of interpreters tried to translate as political prophecy or an eschatological calendar. But the Gnostics read the revelation of John as something more precise, a map of consciousness crossing the seals, the archontic layers, toward the recovery of full light. The seven seals are not future historical events. They are stations of the inner journey, and each of them corresponds to a specific form of forgetfulness that the pneumatic must cross and recognize before recovering what was imprisoned in that layer. This is what the chosen ones do, not in a heroic and effortless way, in an exhausting, frequently confusing, sometimes devastating way, but with a direction that the system cannot cancel. And here we come to the point that I want you to carry from this conversation. You made it this far because something in you recognized the theme, not intellectually first. Before the intellect could process the words, something deeper had already said yes. This recognition that precedes analysis is the pneuma operating. It is the spark responding to its own description. And what this spark wants you to understand is this. All the versions of you that broke were necessary, not because breaking is the proof of strength, but because the breaking was the mechanism the system used to try to calibrate you, and your capacity to continue after each breaking is the proof that the calibration failed. The system could not reduce you to what it can process, and it will not succeed, not because you are invincible. You will feel more pain, more confusion, more moments of doubting everything, but because the frequency you carry was not generated here, cannot be extinguished here, and does not belong to the laws of this system. The Apocryphon of John ends with an instruction that Jesus gives to the John who received the visions. He says, "Write these things down and give them in secret to whoever is worthy." And the Greek word that is at the root of worthy here, axios, does not mean deserving in the moral sense. It means adjusted, calibrated, capable of receiving. You only made it this far because you are axios, not in the sense that you passed a test, in the sense that your internal configuration is capable of receiving what this knowledge carries. And this knowledge does not ask you to abandon the world. It does not ask you to turn away from the people you love, from the projects that matter, from the simple joys that incarnation still offers even within an imperfect system. It asks one thing, that you stop interpreting the struggle as evidence of weakness, that when the internal frequency generates pressure against the external system, and it will generate it, it always will, you recognize what is happening, that it is not a flaw, that it is a frequency greater than the processing capacity of the vessel it is trying to cross. The flame you carry does not burn less bright because the world was not built to support it. It burns brighter. In the Hermetic tradition, there is one final image I want to leave with you. The nous, the divine mind, after seeing its reflection in the mirror of matter and descending toward it, at some point remembers itself. And in that moment of remembrance, there is no battle. There is no dramatic victory over the mirror. The nous simply stops identifying with the reflection. And when it stops identifying with the reflection, the mirror no longer has power over it. You do not need to destroy the system. You need to stop taking the system's reflection of you as the truth. The system says you are weak because you suffer. The reflection says you are defective because you do not fit in. The echo says that sensitivity is vulnerability, that depth is excess, that an unusual frequency is madness. And you today, in this video, in this moment, have the opportunity to do what Sophia did layer by layer, what the nous did in the mirror, what Mary did before Peter. You can name the Archon, not with anger, with recognition. And when an Archon is named with clarity, it loses the ability to pass itself off as the absolute. You are not struggling because you are weak. You are struggling because you arrived here carrying an amount of light that this world, with all its engineering of forgetfulness, has still not managed to put out. And as long as you remain here, as long as the spark keeps moving within you, upward, insistent, irreducible, the work continues, not as a burden, as the only work that was ever truly yours. If what you heard today resonated in something deeper than words, there is a next step that I made specifically for those who made it this far. The Pneumatic Code is a guide I developed from the Nag Hammadi texts, the Corpus Hermeticum, and the Pistis Sophia to help pneumatics recognize and map the specific archontic patterns that appear in each person's life. Not as theory, as a practice of recognition. The link is pinned in the comments and in the description, but available only while this video is up. The flame that cannot be put out needs only to be remembered, and you have just remembered a fragment of it. As the entire text provided has already been fully translated and completed across Part 1 and Part 2, the task is fulfilled.